Good morning. I'm Rollie Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and we're here to talk this morning about think tanks in times of crisis and do they matter? But before we get started, I'd like to first give a shout out and a word of appreciation to Professor James McGann, who is the director of the Think Tanks and Civil Societies program at the Lauder Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. And that's the entity that publishes the annual think tank study. The TTCSP, which is the Think Tanks and Civil Societies program, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, has been around since 1989, and it's focused on collecting data and research on think tank trends and the role that think tanks play as civil society actors in the policymaking process. In 2007, TTCSP developed and launched its global index of think tanks. This index is designed to identify and recognize centers of excellence in all the major areas of public policy research and in every region of the world. I know they're active in at least 81 countries, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of think tanks that they take a look at and review. And I'm very, very proud that FPRI is number 8 worldwide in think tanks under 5 million and number 1 in the US for think tanks. We're number 45 in all US think tanks, so we cracked the top 50, and that's among hundreds of think tanks that are reviewed. We're number 76 in defense worldwide, number 61 in foreign policy worldwide, and number 63 in independent think tanks worldwide that are non-government. So we're very proud to do that, and to say thank you to our support, our board and our members. We couldn't do this important work without you. So today, talking about why think tanks matter, or if they matter in times of crisis, we have FPRI scholars, Dr. John Nagl, former Ambassador Charles Ray, our head of our Asia program, Jacques Delisle, and Ron Granieri. And let me just do a very brief introduction of them. Dr. John Nagl is, in addition to being a senior fellow in FPRI's National Security Program and on the FPRI Board of Advisors, he's the head of the Haverford School. He's also a retired lieutenant colonel in the Army. Ambassador Charles Ray is an FPRI trustee and the director of FPRI's brand new Africa program. He also served as ambassador to the Kingdom of Cambodia and the Republic of Zimbabwe. And he was the first consul general to Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. Jacques Delisle is, as I mentioned, the director of our FPRI's Asia program, the Stephen A. Cousin Professor of Law, Professor of Political Science, and Director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. And Ron Granieri is a Templeton Fellow at FPRI and the Executive Director of FPRI's Center for the Study of the West. He's also a professor at the Army War College, and I see I've forgotten my mandatory language, but I will just say, and I hope this captures it, Ron, that his remarks are his own personal views and do not reflect those of the Army War College, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. So, before we get started, I would also like to is there a thumbs up from Ron? Did that right. So before we get started, it's true confession for me. I have only been in the think tank world for a year, although I was a senior fellow at FPRI for a few years before that. And so I'm a neophyte, so I'll depend on those of you who've been in the think tank world a lot longer than I. And I realized when I introduced John Nagl, I forgot to mention that he was, I believe, the first director of CNAS, the Center for New American Security. Oh, the second. Anyway, so he has He has some deep experience in running think tanks. And I will say, even though I'm a neophyte, when I first got this job, I went around and talked to some heads of other think tanks, including some very large ones. And one who shall remain anonymous, who's the president of one of the largest think tanks in the US, when I said I had no experience, he paused and he said, that will be an advantage. So whether that's true or not, I don't know. But so without further ado, I'm going to open it up to some discussion. And I'm going to start with the very basics and ask our panel, what is a think tank? And maybe I'll just start with John Nagl, since he ran a think tank for a while.
Thanks, Rollie, and what a pleasure to be a part of this distinguished panel and to be able to discuss institutions that I think have greater importance and greater impact than is commonly realized. So as Rollie said, I was actually the second president of the Center for New American Security in Washington, D.C., an organization founded by Kurt Campbell, who is now serving an important role on the National Security Council for President Biden, and Michelle Flournoy, a former high-level defense official in President Obama's Pentagon. And I joined CNAS right out of the Army and really did have no experience in think tanks at that point, and learned very quickly that they serve a number of roles. And I'm going to talk to the Washington roles perhaps briefly first. And certainly CNAS was an administration in waiting. An awful lot of the folks who worked at CNAS went into the State Department and into the Department of Defense when President Obama was elected. And so the American system is very different from that of almost any other democracy in America. Most democracies have permanent bureaucracies in their big institutions of state, and it's just the very, very top one or two people rotate when administrations change. In the United States, there are 4,000 people appointed by the President of the United States to run a number of our executive agencies. And when your team is in office, you're in office, but when your team isn't in office, you have to have a place to hang out. And a bunch of those folks hang out in law offices or as professors, but a whole bunch of them work in think tanks. And in those think tanks, they serve as sort of the loyal opposition when they're not in power, presenting ways to modify policies or suggesting policy changes, and also building intellectual capital for when their team does in fact take over, and so they have ideas ready to go. And so I think that role of providing a government in waiting, providing talent in waiting, and fresh talent in waiting, ready to reinvigorate the American democratic system is enormously important, in addition to many of the things that I think FPRI does very well, including thinking, publishing about, popularizing ideas about, in FPRI's case, foreign policy, national security policy, and then building connective tissue between America and the American people and the American government and American government policies and the outside world, which I think is unbelievably important for the support of the American people behind their democracy.
Thanks, John. Jacques, you hail primarily from the world of academia. What's your perspective on what a think tank is?
Well, I'd agree with everything John just said. I think that's a great description of what think tanks do, and particularly Washington think tanks in the U.S. system. I think there are a few other things as well that are probably more evident from the academic side. I mean, particularly what FPRI does, I think, is produce policy relevant research and commentary that's by a somewhat more academic perspective. And there are other think tanks that do that too. But I think one of the virtues of being not inside the Beltway and having the alignment of scholars we do is that you get people who have university bases or are less immediately often plugged into the government. And so, again, we often sort of describe our work this way, which is, again, theoretically, academically informed, historically informed, policy relevant outputs. So I think that's a big part of it, and one hopes that has an impact on the debate, and I think it does. It also, I would think, would include within its core mission public outreach, and an informed public is a huge part of what makes the American system work. Not just people rotating into positions of authority from think tanks and people who aren't in government providing ideas, but having an informed citizenry, as we've just seen, a citizenry in touch with facts and expertise, would be not a bad thing in terms of our public discourse. I think we could play a role there too.
Thanks, Jacques. I'm going to turn to Ambassador Ray now and expand that. First, what is a think tank, or what should it be? And why do think tanks matter in times of crisis? And when I say times of crisis, we're all thinking of right now, but I candidly can't recall a time when there hasn't been some crisis somewhere.
Well, I mean, like you, Rollie, FPRI is my first think tank. I spent 50 years in the bureaucracy. And so my view of think tanks is shaped by that experience, looking at it from, I hate that term, inside the beltway. I tried to get my mind as outside the beltway as possible during the years I was in the State Department. What I see think tanks as, in addition to what John said, of being the source of a lot of the people who staff policy-making positions when a new administration comes in, as a source of fresh ideas, whether you are the opposition or even when your guys are in office, because I can tell you, and I'm sure that Ron and John can identify with this, when you're in the bureaucracy, your ability to create or put forth new innovative ideas is severely constrained. I mean, you're working in the State Department, for example, you can't get a simple thing done without probably getting 12 to 15 concurrences from different offices around that rabbit warren of buildings. And it really makes getting innovative ideas on the table very difficult. When you can introduce an idea, though, that a think tank developed, and think tanks have the luxury to look at different ways of doing things. You don't have agenda. Well, you do have an agenda, but you don't have these sacred cows you have to protect. And when an idea comes in from a think tank, my experience has been there's less resistance to it than there is to an idea that's popped up by someone within the bureaucracy if it's not part of the orthodox way of doing things. And so, my view is, and your comment is spot on. I was in government from 1962 to 2012. I mean, I can now tell my grandchildren that I actually have a decent, real, regular job. But I don't recall from 1962 to 2012 a time when we didn't have a crisis somewhere in the world. So, I mean, we've been in permanent crisis mode since 1946. I don't count the war. That's a different thing. So I think think tanks are very important because they are the source of out-of-the-box new ways of looking at problems. We look at problems in the bureaucracy, and because we have a limited number of bureaucratic tools, all problems start to look like the problem that fits the tool we have. And the think tanks sometimes shake us out of that rut we're in and force us to look at things in new and different ways.
Thank you, Ray. As a 30-year veteran of the CIA, except for a year and a half I spent at the National Counterterrorism Center, I have to absolutely agree. We often found that when we brought in outsiders from academia, even private sector, they got a lot more respect than those of us in the actual organization. So I think, from my perspective, that's where think tanks can really have more impact than insiders quite often. Ron, you've been around FPRI for a long time. And so I'd be curious, on these two questions I've already asked, what's a think tank, what should it be, and what should we do in times of crisis? But I'm going to broaden it a little bit to what's the best thing you've ever seen a think tank do and why? And as long as it's not FPRI, you can give an example of something that they didn't do so well.
Fair enough. I keep thinking back when I was doing my research for this conference, for this meeting. Several years ago, many years ago, I was reading a story about think tanks, and it described a veteran of a Washington think tank that I will not name had written a song in the style of Gilbert and Sullivan about think tanks. And I have been trying. It's my white whale.
Please.
What's that? Well, you see, I can't sing it, but it's my white whale to find the entire text of it. But all that sticks in my head is the refrain of the song, which is how in times of trouble, I always return, and everybody sings along in the audience, to the tank, to the tank, to the tank. Part campus, part clubhouse, part bank. Right? Those are the two lines that stick in. And that sums up, what is a think tank, right? Is that it is a campus because it is a place of ideas. It's like a campus without students, but it's a campus because it brings together lots of thinkers. It's a clubhouse, whether it's a big private club like that one up on the Upper East Side of New York or in any other place in Washington, D.C., right? Or even here at FPRI, we have members and partners. So we have we're a clubhouse, and we have events for the members of the club. And it's a bank in the sense that it provides material support for research, right? And those three things, which are all important, right? And you don't want to be too cynical or sarcastic, right? Because you need all of those things. You want to have both the community of people who think, you want to be able to reach out to the broader public, and you want people who participate in the events and people who support the organization to feel like they're part of something special. And of course, we all know how all this works is, the money's got to come from somewhere. So, right, so we're part campus, part clubhouse, part bank, right? That is FPRI. Someday I may just take those two lines and write a new song, and we'll sing it at an FPRI annual dinner someday. Anyone who wants to sponsor that, commission that particular project, right? Please contact Rollie Flynn, President, Foreign Policy Research Institute. So that's one thing. And then I was thinking about this in the email that you sent before the meeting, right? When you said that I've been at FPRI a long time, right? Everybody looks in the mirror and they want to think of themselves as young. And I think of myself still as the assistant professor of history who was invited to come to an FPRI event in 2003, which was when I first moved to Philadelphia. And so, and I realized now, I can't beat Ambassador Ray on this, but 17 years, 18 years is a long time to be connected to any place. And so been coming back to FPRI ever since. That I remember those first sessions, and I remember the first paper that I gave at FPRI, which was when we had the study group on America and the West. And it was a paper about the crisis of transatlantic relations, something along those lines. In 2003, right, that crisis was built around the Iraq War. And this gets to your question about how do we deal with, what's the purpose of think tanks in crisis. I gave my paper about problems between the United States and which eventually became an article in Orbis between the United States and Europe. And when it was over, the president of FPRI at the time, Harvey Zickerman, who was a very imposing and impressive figure, always wearing his three-piece suit with a gold chain with his Phi Beta Kappa key, that he came up to me and he clapped me on the shoulder and he said, "Ron, that was a great paper. Reminds me of a paper that I gave at FPRI 25 years ago. Back then there was a crisis of the transatlantic world too." And I didn't know, you don't know what to say in a situation like that. It's like, so was he telling me that there's nothing new? But he says, it's good that we talk about these things, is basically was the point of it. But I thought that was a very nice way for across the generations, let's say, to reach into this discussion. And that's what I think, once again, without wanting to sound cynical, right? Our job, and if we take our job seriously at FPRI, we're not necessarily here to solve problems. It'd be nice if we could solve the occasional problem, but the most important thing we can do is to remind people that these problems exist so that they keep thinking about them, so that maybe even if we don't solve them, at least if we keep talking about them, solutions may develop. And this is and this goes back to what Jacques said and what Ambassador Ray said and what John said, right? The idea of we want to lubricate the wheels of conversation. And that means in and out of government, in and out of academia, to find different outlets. And so when you think, what are the really important things think tanks can do, is that we provide ways to reach the public. that are, this means, we, of course, FPRI has had Orbis, a honest to goodness quarterly academic journal with all of the things that go with it that since 1957, but that we also take it seriously, that we produce varieties of written products to reach different audiences. And something we've done, especially in the last, gosh, what is it now? Last 8 years or so that I've been more directly involved with the center, our development of public facing programs that we bring audiences together with speakers. And that's when John has an audience up on the mainline discussion, the mainline conversations, when people come to what used to be Geopolitics with Granary, when people come to our other events, that we are creating a community of curious, well-informed people. And that's really when it comes right down to it, what our long-term purpose is to create this kind of community of thinkers and doers, so that these conversations can remind us, sometimes it's good to be reminded that problems aren't new, not so that we are enervated by the realization that we haven't solved them yet, but so that we understand that that they can be managed too. Because the beauty of a problem that is recurring is we realize that the last time it didn't lead to the end of the world. So we don't have to worry about it necessarily leading to the end of the world, even if we need to try to figure out a way to solve it. And so that's how I think about our job here at FPRI.
Thanks. And one of the expressions I heard too when I was doing my initial research on think tanks when I first got this job was that we should try to be do tanks, not think tanks. Let's have an impact. And that also your remarks on the Transatlantic Alliance also reminded me of our newly launched Robert Strauss Who Pay project, where we once again are going to be looking at whether the Western alliances. So some things just, they keep coming around. And I'd also like to do a reminder, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, not the chat, in the Q&A. And in the chat, if you're interested in Professor McGann's think tank and civil societies project, we have put a link to that study and that program in our chat box. So please take a look at that. It's really quite interesting. John, what mistakes have you seen think tanks make?
Well, obviously, FPRI and CNAS have never made any mistakes, with the possible exceptions of putting several of the people on this panel on their mastheads. I think that, and I'm a foreign policy, national security person, so my history and my examples are all from that world. I think that as you look at the critical and grievous mistakes the United States has made in that field over the past generation or so, the most grievous is almost certainly the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And there were a number of institutions that supported that invasion who should not have. And that goes well beyond the think tank world, of course. There were grievous errors made in reporting, including from the paper of record in the lead up to that. There were mistakes made in your former agency, Rollie, that were very substantial. But and I very much appreciate what Ambassador Ray said and what you said, Rollie, that when you're in the mix, it's invaluable to have somebody who really does get to think, right? They can spend a week just thinking and writing, and right. You really count on those people who are a little bit removed from the fray to be able to ask the hard questions and to step back and ask, what are the second and third term implications of this? And for the invasion of Iraq in 2003, I'm going to throw a bone to a colleague of Ron's and an old friend of mine, a man named Conrad Crane at the Army War College, wrote a paper before the invasion of Iraq in 2003 that said this is very likely to provoke very intense sectarian conflict that will last for a long time, for which the United States is unprepared. And pay attention to this challenge, and sadly nobody did. And so Kahn wrote his memoirs and entitled them, used the word Cassandra in the title, because he was in fact in a think tank. The think tank did what it was supposed to do, but folks just didn't listen. And that I think underlines both the importance of these institutions doing what they do, thinking hard about important questions for the nation, and then figuring out ways to become a do tank to influence national policy. And maybe we'll talk a bit more about that a little later.
One of the concerns I've heard expressed, and I've observed myself, that is raised about think tanks, and to broaden it larger, the whole international affairs and national security field, is the lack of diversity and inclusion. And for years and years, our foreign policy establishment was, I think you could say, a very not diverse place. And I hailed from the CIA, and in my entry class, I guess I hope I'm not giving away anything. There were only, I think, 6 of us who were female, and the class numbered in the dozens. And I think at CIA, we definitely learned that diversity is really important when you're studying and operating in countries all around the world. You don't get the kind of access you might get if you can blend in a little better, both in order to understand the cultures and what's going on, but as well, and of course in my business where you're trying to disappear, it's hard to disappear in some parts of the world when you look like me. So I'll throw it out to any of you who'd like to speak on this topic. How can we do this better, and why should we?
I'm glad you brought that up, because you talk about your experience when you entered the agency. I remember when in 1982, when I retired from the Army and joined the Foreign Service, we had much smaller incoming classes of Foreign Service officers in those days. I think my class was 26, and in that 26, the number of people who could be classified as minorities, that is non-European descent, was about 5 out of 26. And I thought that was bad until I got to my first post in China in 1983, when in China we had the embassy, and I think we had 3 consulates at the time, well over 2,000 Americans spread across all those posts. And of that 2,000 or so Americans, there were 4 Asian Americans and 2 African Americans. And we had one Hispanic. And, so to the Chinese, and I ran into this quite often. I actually spent 4 years, I was supposed to go for an 18-month tour, and I ended up spending, almost 3 years there. It gave the Chinese a very distorted view of the United States. I mean, we were not able to communicate to the Chinese people, or the government for that matter, the true picture of what the U.S. was. I can remember a number of times meeting Chinese and having them actually question that I was an American diplomat. That's just, to them, that's just impossible. You don't look like an American to us. And so there's that problem. And that's I think, forget about having to try and blend in, but to try and actually be seen as a representative of the U.S. Until we do a better job at diversity, that's going to be a task. The other is points of view. I mean, when you have an organization where everyone in that organization comes from the same ethnic, economic, geographic, educational background, you get stagnation. I mean, John, I was former Army too, so I think I can say this. It's like being in an organization in the Army where all the officers are West Point graduates. You get pretty stale, just in a rut thinking. You don't get new ideas. You don't get any variety. You get groupthink.
You're hurting me, Ambassador.
Say again?
I feel seen. You're hurting me. I agree with you completely. And I saw this in a number of my foreign deployments, how valuable, one of the great advantages of the United States is that we draw people from every corner of the world and they can become Americans. They can become full-fledged Americans. And in a global world, we need their perspectives, we need their language, we need their understanding of history and their connections back to their home countries. So we've got to do a better job of this.
And there's also the question of the sort of empathic interchanges with people. If you can't identify with the people in a country, what motivates them, you can't really make good decisions in dealing with them. And when we tap into all of the different backgrounds, socioeconomic, ethnic, religious, or whatever, in this country, we have a greater pool of empathy that we can bring to bear on problems outside the country.
Sure.
When I served in Latin America, I saw this in spades. And I had a staff in Latin America that I would say was about 2/3 of Latin American origin. So absolute fluent Spanish speakers, understood the cultures. And when we would go to meet, say, with the Minister of Interior, we would come away and they would have heard something almost completely different. Not that it was, we heard the same words, but their fluency was better than mine. But they understood that conversation at a much deeper level than I did, and what was not being said. And even the body language, they got so much more than I did. So I just can't emphasize enough how much that helped.
Right. And Rollie, I also, based on this question and also some of the things I see in the Q&A, one of the real challenges for think tanks is to be willing to have a variety of opinions. Right, that we should thrive on. If we thrive on conversation, we should thrive on disagreement. And yet the very strong temptation for any organization is to have a clear point of view and to hammer on that point of view. And if I can be, materialist for a second, right, that's often where the money is, right? Is that people will give money to an organization if they know what it's going to conclude. And one of the real temptations for a think tank to be honest with itself and to be honest with its donors is to say, listen, if you're interested in these topics, these areas, yes, we're going to give you our best shot at understanding them, but we're not going to promise you that the outcome of our discussions is going to, we don't deliver, outcomes. We deliver, and so we want, and then this goes to the question of, Mario Ricciardi asks you, how are think tanks different from lobbying organizations? Well, the way they should be different from lobbying organizations is they don't lobby, right? That our job is it should not be to have a clear and obvious point of view. Our argument should be to develop ideas, to be transparent about the way we are debating and discussing and coming to our conclusions, and to hope that people will listen to the conclusions, that they will see how we got there. But the real significance of a think tank is being a place of free disputation and inquiry, right? That's and that's sometimes hard to do, because how do you find people who are willing to interact with folks that share broad interests but not conclusions? Because otherwise one of the things I've really liked about FPRI in my time with it is that we may share interests, but we don't share conclusions. And that's how it should be. But there's a lot of temptation out there. And that's, going back to John's comment about Con Crane and the folks at SSI or about dealing with Iraq, is that if you get the idea that the only way you're going to get ahead is to say what you think the people above you want to hear you say, then you're not going to give your best advice. And you got to be willing to you hope that your honesty will be rewarded. But if it's not rewarded, that shouldn't lead you to abandon your honesty.
I couldn't emphasize that more. The idea that we do not do advocacy, that yes, we are a place where we have independent thought and independent conclusions. FPRI itself is nonpartisan. We don't take a stand. Not so much for our scholars who are all over the map in terms of their political perspectives and their views of the world, which I think is healthy and a good thing. We've already talked about diversity of opinion and diversity of people participating. The other thing I would mention on diversity and inclusion, which I think is really important, and I've observed it, one of the issues we have, and we have a very strong internship program, which we're really, really proud of. Our interns are in high places. They start here, we select the very best, and they go on and they do terrific things. However, our internships are unpaid, as they are in a lot of think tanks. And just by the fact of that, we have a self-selecting population who can afford to spend a summer and not have to work at McDonald's or take a job to pay for perhaps their family, for their schooling, for their books, etc. And it's something, you know, I'm putting in a plug. If anyone out there in the audience feels as strongly as I do about this, let's help us build a program where we can have interns who don't just come from middle and upper middle class of our population. And again, it's getting at diversity. You know, you raise a topic though, Ron, that I think is really important. And a lot of think tanks in recent years have come in for a lot of criticism for taking money from certain countries in the world and doing what some would perceive as advocacy. Any observations on that? Anyone?
Yeah, I think there are sort of two pieces to that problem. One is impropriety, and the other is the appearance of impropriety.
Yes.
So, you know, obviously, it is a huge problem if your opinions are being bought and sold, and we've spoken about that on this panel. It's obviously a problem if there's an appearance that that's going on. So, on the other hand, as Ron said with the bank line in his lyrics, resources are necessary. So I think it's a very difficult thing to navigate and negotiate. And it strikes me as not an insurmountable challenge for a well-run think tank to make it very clear to donors of any stripe that we'll look into what you want us to look into if it fits with our agenda, but the answers are going to be what the answers are. And you know, we all know stories, we won't name names, but where Washington think tanks have gotten into big trouble for appearing to skew not just the research agenda, but the research outcomes. The harder one to manage is the perception of impropriety, because you can be completely on the up and up doing everything right, but the word is going to get out there that money is coming from a certain source. And if the opinions that you produce, even through a perfectly proper process, align with the donor's interests, then there's going to be the shadow cast. And part of the problem is also it's a moving target. Certain sources of funding are not suspect at the time you take them on, but they become in the public discourse a lot more suspect over time. I mean, I work on China. Yeah, we all know what the view of Chinese sourced money would be at this point compared to what it was 10 years ago. The Saudis are another story. So I think it's a really challenging environment to negotiate. It would be nice if one didn't have to have the resource constraints that made that a consideration, but it's a real challenging one. And you know, it's by no means purely an international problem. I mean, you know, about Google funding research and various things. Almost everybody is going to be perceived as having an agenda, and I think all you can do is do your best to be transparent about where your funding comes. Be very clear about your principles on how you can fund research in certain areas but can't expect the outcomes. And to just do one's best to do high quality work that is well supported. And you're going to take some hits, but it's just part of the world we all live in. And I don't think you can do any better than that. And I think it would be great to have a truly independent endowment. Harvey Sickerman used to joke that an endowment is not worth the trouble unless you care to give us one. but if you're doing programmatic funds, you're always going to have to grapple with that. And I think it's true in any institution that depends on so much philanthropic donations. We certainly see it in the universities too.
Totally. Well, I was going to say the issue of reputations. They are developed and they can be hard to change. And that's one of an honest organization, tries to be, as Jacques says, very transparent. And up to a certain point, right, there's only so much you can do. If you're doing your best to be transparent and to let people know how you're going to, how you're approaching questions, you can only hope that the public is being as honest and transparent in their assessment of the products. Because FPRI, when it was formed, had a very clear, let's say, political profile. The history of FPRI is a fascinating subject for itself. And the FPRI of today is not the FPRI of 1955. It is connected to that, right? In the same way that you don't completely shed the connection to your parents, but to try to think that organizations grow, they change, they go through phases. And the best you can try to do is to be devoted to the cause of advancing knowledge and understanding. And you hope that people will honor that and value that. But to a certain point, you may find that there are people who already think they know exactly what FPRI is all about, and nothing you're going to do is going to change their mind. And sometimes you got to let the chips fall in situations like that.
I think those are really, really good points, the perception in particular. And I will say that, again, we are nonpartisan. We've always been nonpartisan, but there are perceptions about who and what FPRI is. And as I mentioned at the beginning, our scholars, we don't control who they are and what they believe. And I've been here now a year, and I get complaints about us being too right-wing. I get complaints about us being too left-wing. And I kind of figure as long as I'm getting them from both sides, I'm doing okay. But it's a hard balance to strike. I will say that. And so I think it's time to go to questions from the audience. And we have the honor of having Professor James McGann in our audience. And he asks, does the term think tank accurately and effectively capture what they do today? The term think tank and do tank doesn't capture it either any thoughts on a rethink of the term think tank? If you could call us something, what would you call us? Any ideas?
Maybe a foreign policy research institute. So it's right.
Quick, somebody write that one down. I think that I just got legs.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Trademark it quickly.
It's interesting you say that, because we often say about ourselves that, we do research. We're better than a lot of places because we do research. And yet I always take it a little further back and say, well, why do we do research? And I think at its essence, we're educators. We're educators of policymakers. We're educators of the public. We're educators of young folks coming up. And research without an audience and without an application, to me, is a little too shallow, but that's just me. Any other thoughts on a name?
My philosophy has always been, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I mean, think tank is a sort of easy to say, easy to remember way of saying, this is a place where we try to get people to do what's very important to do, and that's think. I mean, tank, maybe you could say think that, or, think box, think room. But I don't, why, before you can do properly, you have to think. And so, why should it not be a think tank? We are a tank where we're trying to germinate thinking and get people to go out and do things in an effective, proper way. If it ain't broke, why do we need to fix it?
Good question.
I agree. It's a funny thing, because I agree that it's not a term that accurately captures what we do, but I have a hard time coming up with anything that isn't 20 words long, and that's, as Charles points out, a lousy branding idea. So I guess I have two thoughts on it. One is, many terms are sort of as opposed to what. And I think that because think tanks operate largely in the policy influencing world, directly or indirectly, the idea is we're thinking, we're not just reacting. We're taking some time to digest and stand off. And so I think looked at from the policy world, the think part gets the emphasis. Looked at from the academic world, it's more the do part gets the emphasis rather than knowledge for knowledge's sake. I will say that the term that's been used to render think tank into Chinese, the tank is quite literally a tank in the VAT sense, but the thing for think is actually more knowledge, like knowledge producers, which is part of the mix too, because of course thinking without information is not a good idea, and information without thought is not all that useful.
Interesting. We have a question from Paul Dickler that is directed to, and this is his word, the newbie, Ron. Why do think tanks have a certain tendency to have schisms and disallow certain lines of inquiry? And he notes that the biggest correct prediction at FPRI, the breakup of the Soviet Union. Ron?
Yeah, the problem of schisms. I mean, that relates to my thinking earlier about how the pressure to have consistent lines of thought can lead to the development of sort of hardened divisions. I think that's a danger that happens in academic departments. It happens at universities. It happens in long-term bureaucracies. It shouldn't happen at think tanks in the sense that, and this is where, especially think tank like FPRI, which has a small core of permanent staff and a large community of scholars, that we should not be encouraging schisms, right? We should be keeping people in contact with each, in communication with each other, even if they disagree. But it is, once again, to think about the proper metaphors, right? It takes constant cultivation, right? Like if you think about the tank has to be, if you have to stir the stuff up so that it doesn't settle and it doesn't, you don't end up with a lot of sludge in the bottom of your tank. And so part of that is but part of that is part of this whole issue of how we manage these institutions, because you can get to the point where if it's the same people talking about the same things, they may find that everybody knows what everybody's going to say before they say it, and that's not healthy for anyone. But that, as I say, that's not just a think tank challenge. That's everybody knows of the academic departments where decisions are never made, because as soon as one person takes a position, they already know the people in the department who are going to disagree with them. Or like Henry Higgins says in George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, right? That the problem with language is that as soon as an Englishman opens his mouth, he gives 7 people around him a reason to despise him because of their accents and their perspectives. And we don't want to be like that. And recognizing that we don't want to be like that should be a core part of a think tank's mission. And then my smart aleck comment about predicting the end of the Soviet Union. The good news is that if you predict something for about 30 years, your chances of it eventually happening are pretty good.
We have what I think is a really interesting question from Rishab Chatty, which is, what's the difference between a think tank analyst and a journalist?
I'm happy to start on that one. So I think journalists report what happens and write what's often called the first draft of history. Think tankers analyze that. They rely upon what happens as raw material as they are doing deeper analysis. And I've actually done some journalism while a think tanker at when I was visiting Iraq or Afghanistan a decade ago, and reporting on what was happening in those countries and the American and Allied efforts in those countries. And I would do a combination of journalism, reporting on what I saw, and then deeper analysis of what it meant in terms of long-term American strategy for the region. But so I do think they are very complementary crafts. Both are essential to each other. And one of the wonderful things some think tanks do is have journalists in residence at their institutions in order to allow journalists to, for instance, write books and allow journalists to use the facts and the knowledge they've acquired and then reflect on it when they don't have a daily or a weekly deadline. And I think that's a wonderful sort of symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, really, really, really interesting. I recall at one point, it was probably in the mid-90s, and when I was sitting in the DDO's office, that's the Deputy Director of Operations office, I got a call, a hair on fire call from the NSC saying, there are riots in downtown Port-au-Prince. Why aren't you reporting on that? And of course, you have to be polite when you respond, but we're not CNN. We don't roll the cameras. And this is the same thing with think tanks. We are the why is it happening? What's the story behind the story? What's the impact? What's, again, it's that deep analysis. We're not just running, it's not, reportage, running the camera and playing it. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah, okay. We have a comment and a question from Tanzel Kokyusial, who is a Brigadier General in the Turkish Air Force and Defense Attaché in DC. He says, in the USA, the elected can make decisions that do not fit the interests of the country in order to be elected again or to look cute to the voters. I think it's a responsibility of think tanks to show them the right way. Do you believe each think tank makes independent and objective assessments? Who would like to take that on? Jacques?
I'll take it on in the very limited sense that this loops back, I think, to an earlier topic of discussion, which is what kind of mistakes have think tanks made? And it seems to me the biggest mistake they make is cooking their analysis to play, as my colleagues in the panel have said, to play to particular audiences. And the temptation is the lure of influence, impact, connections, and things like that, and then becoming somebody who is pandering for them. There's a joke that used to make the rounds that if you wanted anything read, it had to be "and the war on terror" at one point in your memo, right? So this is currying for influence. In China, the joke is has to say "and the Belt and Road Initiative." So that what really undermines what think tanks can do is if they pander to the political opinions of those who they want connections to, then you're not even actually gaining influence. You're just sort of creating the echo chamber, and I think that's one of the worst temptations. And that's just it strikes me as a fool's errand. And so the best think tanks, the ones that survive, don't really do that. What I worry about a little bit with how that question might be interpreted is there's a huge difference between pandering to tell the would-be boss what he wants to hear versus being on one side or another of a bunch of highly divisive issues. It strikes me there's absolutely nothing wrong with think tanks being the Democratic Party foreign policy establishment in waiting, or the Republican Party foreign policy establishment when that group gets in power. The idea is that you have people who get the time out of government to sit there and reflect and come back refreshed with perspectives they might not have, and to then actually be in there making the decisions as opposed to the slippage that inevitably occurs if they're just reading ideas from think tanks. So I wouldn't want to take too sharp a distinction between pandering and purely objective, standoffish, I'm neutral kinds of analysis. There is a gray area, and the U.S. system at its best trades in that space. At its worst, it slides into things that compromise the independence of think tanks.
And Jacques, you make an excellent point, right? To get people to read your memo, to make sure that you say "and the war on terror." I would say the flip side of that is the best way to get people to stop listening to you is to start every answer with, "Well, it's really complicated," right? Because that's the first way to get people to know that, well, I'm not going to listen to whatever this person's going to say. So the challenge is to communicate how complicated things are, while also showing that you're interested in trying to explain them, right? And that I think is that's the puzzle. And just like the puzzle of, in democratic states, right? The real challenge is, right, elected officials are supposed to reflect public opinion. Right? They are supposed to make the public happy. If you or I think what makes the public happy shouldn't make them happy, right? That's one thing. And we can certainly make arguments to say the public needs to rethink about this. But we're at a fundamental, let's say, paradox of foreign policy making in a democracy. Is you can only make policy if you get elected. And sometimes you have to get elected by saying things about foreign policy that simplify things, that shave the truth, that manage them. And so once again, the answer with all this, right, is not to assume that there's a right and wrong out there, and you got to make sure that you're always on the side of the right. It's to make sure that you are engaged in the conversation so that you can make sure that that particular, that trend in public opinion does not lead to a gallop over a cliff. But to manage that means you have to develop long-term, painstaking sort of credibility and interest. You can't always just be following the trends, but you can't always just be, if you're constantly the person who says, well, everybody else is wrong and I am right. That may indeed be true, but after a while nobody listens to you, and then where are you? And that's what I think is where the model should be, this image of a community of conversation.
We have time for one more question, and we have an interesting question from Ira Strauss, who asks, what about the danger of leaning over backward to show lack of bias? This seems particularly a problem for a think tank such as FPRI, which does not share the dominant academic bias. Those who do share that bias face less pressure on them to prove a lack of bias. The good people on this program have several times today, my screen just shifted, have several times today apologized for FPRI having been too much on the right of the standard academic bias in earlier times, and trying today to distance itself from the past and live down its reputation among those who do share the prevalent biases. This strikes me as running a real risk of actually losing an honest, non-biased centering. What do you think about that? Ron, since you know us?
I got to say, I don't remember apologizing for anything, and I don't apologize. And so I would say that we could talk about what people think they hear when they hear certain terms and certain conversations, but it is a challenge, right? That FPRI is, if FPRI is considered to be in a different place than other institutions, then when I say that that people should not assume that because they think they can pigeonhole an organization, they know what that organization's answer to every problem is going to be. Just as I think that I can know that somebody is center right, but that doesn't mean that that there's a checklist of policy questions that they're always going to be on the same side of. And I think that modeling an openness to different conversations and different points of view is not a sign of weakness, right? Weakness is the rigidity that says there's only one set of answers, or that somehow I have to choose a certain set of answers because it's the only way for me to stand up against what I consider to be my enemies. And that's something that we need to think about as an organization, just like the United States needs to think about that when it deals with policies in the world, right? We don't have to apologize for whatever positions we have, as long as we know that we are being honest in our pursuit of those positions.
Thanks, Ron. Okay, Jacques?
I just in addition to that FPRI in some ways is relatively well positioned on this. I mean, yes, there is a reputation that it was a right-leaning think tank back in the day. It's more of, but there are two things. One is because we are not either party's government in waiting, we don't have that kind of quality to it. And because we are relatively weighted toward affiliated scholars rather than people who are full-time on staff. So we have the ability to bring together, much of our power is convening power rather than in-house power, which is why we're cheap to operate given what we put out. And so we quite consciously, when we put together activities or panels or a special issue of Orbis, we look at the range of respectable, reputable, insightful opinion. And you go back and look at some of these things and they're really quite diverse. And I think we do that consciously, but we're also well positioned to do that because we don't have 10 people who produce the vast quantity of what we do in any given area. It really is a movable feast.
I could not have said that better myself, Jacques. Exactly what I was thinking. We retain our fresh new approach because we're constantly bringing on new scholars and new topics and new ways of looking at things. And I think as long as we continue to do that, we won't get entrenched in any way if we can. sadly, our time has come to an end. So I'd like to say thank you to all of our panelists. And again, thank you to Professor McGann for the terrific work his institute does, his program does. And thank you to all of you for joining us and for your support of this wonderful organization. Take care and hope to see you soon.